Imagine you're watching daytime television, and it's like the late 1980s. The studio lights are bright, the audience is buzzing, and the host of the show is pulling a literal radio flyer red wagon onto the stage.
Right. The famous wagon.
Yes. And inside that wagon is a massive, just gelatinous mound of meat, specifically 67 pounds of animal fat.
It's quite an image.
It really is. The host is wearing these size 10 Calvin Klein jeans, and she points to this pile of fat and tells millions of viewers, this is what I used to carry around with me. It's visceral. It's, a little shocking. And on the surface, it just looks like a very dramatic weight loss reveal.
Yeah, and it was certainly framed that way for the promos, right?
Yeah.
But if you look at the underlying mechanics of that moment, you aren't just watching a diet success story. You are watching the exact moment a culture fundamentally changes how it processes human vulnerability.
Right. Because usually when we talk about diagnosing a massive shift in society, we look for something concrete. It's like an X-ray of a broken arm.
Absolutely.
You look at the film, you see the jagged white line, and the doctor points and says, there's the fracture, it's binary, it's clean. But when you step into the world of our modern emotional landscape, when you try to pinpoint exactly how we all started using words like closure or diagnosing our friends as toxic or aggressively defending our truth, that X-ray machine is just utterly useless.
Yeah, the diagnostic landscape is completely murky. It is the absolute definition of muddy waters.
Definitely.
Because the shift wasn't legislated.
Yeah.
It wasn't a sudden technological invention. It was a slow, methodical rewiring of our moral vocabulary. And if we want to understand the hidden architecture of the culture you and I live in today, we really have to look closely at the architect.
And that is exactly what we are doing for you today. Looking back from our current vantage point today, Thursday, March 12th, 2026, we are going to explore the roots of our modern confessional culture. Our mission for this deep dive is to examine how one woman completely rewired the way we process our own lives. We're using Eva Ilau's sociological text, Oprah Winfrey and the Glamour of Misery, to do this.
It's such a brilliant book.
It really is. And we are looking way beyond the television ratings here. We are looking beyond the billionaire status. We are going to unpack the moral sociology of Oprah Winfrey and how she invented a cultural genre that took everyday private suffering and turned it into a highly marketable public narrative.
Yeah, and to really grasp the sheer scale of this phenomenon, we kind of have to deliberately strip away our familiarity with her.
Like unknow her, almost.
Exactly. We have to look at this through a cold, historical, and sociological lens. Sociologists do not throw around comparisons to the Pope lightly.
No, they definitely don't.
But that is the actual scale we are dealing with here. A cultural empire that spanned television, publishing, and massive philanthropy, completely dictating the moral compass for millions of people.
Okay, let's unpack this, because it's fascinating. For a long time, traditional cultural studies didn't really know what to do with her.
They really struggled with it.
Yeah, academics used to look at popular culture mostly as a tug-of-war. Like, who holds the power and how do the masses resist that power? It was all about economics and political dominance.
Right, that was the old framework. But that framework completely fails to capture what daytime talk television actually did. The shift toward moral sociology means examining how a cultural product actually helps people make sense of their lives.
How so?
Well, how does it help them navigate their values and their moral dilemmas? Under this specific lens, the host of a daytime talk show isn't just an entertainer. She operates as a moral entrepreneur.
A moral entrepreneur. But she certainly wasn't embraced as a moral leader by the intellectual establishment back then.
Oh, not at all.
You look at the reviews and the cultural commentary from the late 80s and 90s, and the disdain from the old elites is just palpable. There is a quote from a prominent fiction writer of the era who flat out called the show white trailer trash.
Ouch. Yeah, that's a famous one.
Right. This critic claimed the show debased language and emotion, handing people glib psychological formulas, so they ended up walking around talking like fortune cookies. I mean, it is a brutal assessment.
It is brutal. But from a sociological perspective, that kind of intense, vitriolic backlash is actually goldmine.
Really? Why?
Because when a cultural object deeply irritates the established tastes of the elite, it acts like a flare. It illuminates the hidden boundaries of middle-class taste. The traditional guardians of culture felt genuinely threatened, and we have to ask why. Why did a woman talking to regular people in a television studio provoke such intense anger from the intellectual class?
I'd argue it's because she completely demolished a sacred boundary. The traditional elite mindset dictates that private suffering belongs in the private sphere.
Exactly. Keep it quiet.
Right. You take your family trauma to a therapist or, to a priest, or you keep it locked behind the closed doors of your living room. You absolutely do not sell your intimate traumas on daytime television between commercials for dish soap.
Yeah, that blurring of public commerce and private pain is exactly the friction point. But to understand why the audience eagerly embraced what the elites hated, we have to look at what the sociologist Max Weber observed about human culture.
Okay, bring in Weber.
So Weber theorized that culture is, at its core, a response to chaos. Human beings just cannot tolerate a chaotic, meaningless existence.
Right, we need structure.
Exactly. So we build cultural frameworks, rational systems, to help us explain and manage a chaotic world.
So if traditional religion gave us a framework to deal with suffering by promising a resolution in the afterlife, is Oprah providing a secular, televised framework to deal with the chaos of everyday life right now?
That is the core dynamic. I mean, think about the late 20th century. Intimate relationships became incredibly chaotic. Divorce rates were up. Traditional family structures were fracturing. Gender roles were shifting rapidly.
Your world is changing fast.
Yeah, the old inherited rules simply didn't apply anymore. There was a massive void. And into that void steps this rationalized therapeutic system. It offered people a vocabulary of self-management to cope with the chaos of late modern intimacy.
But to build a secular ministry of that magnitude, you need a very specific kind of architect. The text spends a lot of time analyzing the raw material of her own life story. The specific term used is habitus.
Right, habitus, it's a great concept.
And for you listening, think of habitus like an invisible backpack of social reflexes and instincts you carry around. You don't even realize you're wearing it, but it completely dictates how you walk into a room, how you perceive a threat, and how you naturally communicate.
It's the deeply ingrained dispositions shaped by our environment, yes. And looking at this specific habitus, there are 4 critical elements that combine to create this unique moral entrepreneur.
Let's go through them.
The first is the deep identification with African American heritage, specifically the legacy of resilience. It's alignment with historical figures who endured immense adversity, like Sojourner Truth, filming one's own life as a continuation of that fortitude.
But the second element is where we really see the communication style take shape, right? The Southern Black Church.
Absolutely.
We're talking about an environment that prioritizes high emotionality, oral storytelling, and a very specific kind of moral action. It wasn't necessarily about abstract systemic political theory. It was about immediate, tangible relief of suffering through spiritual and moral framing.
And we have to pause on that distinction, because it is vital to understanding the mainstream appeal of the show. She famously avoided framing her work as radical politics. She was known to say that the minute she heard terms like task force or community organization, she knew the effort was in trouble.
Which, to a lot of political activists sounds like a total cop-out.
Oh, for sure.
It sounds like abandoning systemic change in favor of making people just feel better about their circumstances.
It is a very common critique. But sociologically, what's fascinating here is that refusing to be a traditional political spokesperson was a highly effective strategy.
Because it broadened her appeal.
Exactly. By avoiding polarizing political categories, she mobilized universal moral themes. She took issues that could have been framed as systemic class struggles and turned them into ethical and spiritual struggles. That transition made her message incredibly palatable to a broad, middle-class, predominantly white audience.
It's like she took the deep communal catharsis of the Southern Baptist Church and ported it directly into the secular, individualized space of daytime TV. The rhythm was preaching, but the gospel was self-actualization.
That is perfectly stated. And that leads directly into the third element of her habitus, her experience navigating frail, shifting family structures.
Right, her childhood was very unstable.
Very. She was moving between different relatives across Mississippi, Wisconsin, and Tennessee. So for her, a family was not a rigid, biologically determined unit. It was fluid. It was arbitrarily broken and reassembled.
Yeah.
She even noted once that she felt a deeper maternal connection to figures like Maya Angelou than to her own biological mother, whom she rarely expressed physical affection toward.
And by decoupling biology from the emotional definition of family, she was already living the exact premise of what daytime television would become. I mean, the entire genre is built on the breakdown and reconfiguration of the family unit. Think about how many episodes you've seen where the biological family is the source of the trauma and the chosen family is the source of the healing.
Yeah, which requires an immense amount of social agility to navigate. And that's the fourth element of her habitus, this constant crossing of social worlds.
Yeah.
She navigated deep rural poverty and segregation, but also found herself in affluent white suburban educational environments.
That's a huge shift.
Massive. If you survive that kind of whiplash, you develop an incredible virtuosity in reading different moral rooms. You learn how to translate pain across demographic lines.
But that same agility meant she was an incredibly poor fit for the rigid structures of the time. Like, let's look at her early career. She lands a job as a news anchor in Baltimore.
Right? Local news.
And by all traditional metrics of broadcast journalism, she was a failure. She was sent out to cover a local fire, and instead of delivering a stoic, objective report on the property damage, she broke down on camera. She burst into tears, completely overwhelmed by her compassion for the victims who had just lost their home.
Yeah, and in the paradigm of the 1970s evening news, a weeping anchor is a liability.
Total disaster.
Journalism demanded neutrality and emotional distance, but that exact failure of objectivity is the seed of the new genre. The inability to be a cold, distant observer wasn't a flaw. It was the exact empathic temperament required to build a therapeutic empire.
And this is where the narrative of the self-veiled persona originates. Think about the classic American success story. We are fed the Horatio Alger myth, or like the Bill Gates Silicon Valley wonderkin story.
The self-made man.
Right. The narrative is always about an individual who achieves dominance through sheer talent, relentless willpower, and an almost detached invulnerability. They win by hiding their weaknesses. But this daytime empire was built on the complete inversion of that myth. The success of the brand was entirely dependent on the relentless, highly publicized telling of her own failures.
The creation of the therapeutic biography is a fascinating sociological mechanism. It operates as a feminine counter-narrative to the masculine myth of self-reliance.
How does it counter it exactly?
Well, in therapeutic biography, you don't achieve success by burying your traumas. You achieve success by actively dragging them into the light, casting them in a psychological framework, and demonstrating your ongoing process of overcoming them.
Oh, wow. Yeah. She publicized a childhood of horrific sexual abuse. She talked openly about a teenage pregnancy and miscarriage. She discussed staying in toxic relationships where she allowed herself to be treated terribly. She didn't become a cultural icon in spite of these things. The public processing of these traumas was the product. Which brings us back to that wagon of fat on the stage.
Yes. The 67 pounds of beef fat.
Exactly. The visual is so arresting. But as you mentioned earlier, it's not just a diet reveal. When she pulls that wagon out, she is materializing her psychological burden. The physical fat represented her lack of self-esteem, her childhood trauma, the protective layers she built around herself.
And the most important part of that specific storyline isn't the victory of the weight loss.
Wait, what is it then?
It's what happened next. She eventually gained the weight back. In a traditional success narrative, that is a humiliating defeat. But in the therapeutic framework, her public confession of gaining the weight back, her admission to a loss of resolve, was actually more valuable than the weight loss itself.
That makes so much sense.
Yeah, the failure became a new, commercially viable chapter of spiritual struggle. It proved she was still in the trenches with her audience.
She systematically dismantled the illusion of traditional stardom. Look at the Hollywood stars of that era. They were remote. They were pristine, untouchable images. They lived in mansions behind high gates and only spoke through publicists.
Fleetly inaccessible.
Totally. But she created what the analysis calls familiar stardom. My favorite example of this is a famous feature in O magazine titled Blowing Our Cover.
Oh, a masterful piece of media strategy.
She literally devoted an entire photo spread to showing the readers the exhausting, chaotic reality of making her look glamorous. She showed the massive team of lighting technicians, makeup artists, hairstylists, and wardrobe consultants required to produce the flawless cover image. She was actively deconstructing her own glamour to send a message: I am not naturally better than you. I just have a bigger budget.
That calculated vulnerability is essential. By deconstructing her own image, she maintains a domestic peer-to-peer relationship with the audience. She isn't speaking down to them from a pedestal. She's sitting beside them on the couch.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because television didn't just record the milestones of her life. The television format actively dictated them.
Yes.
When she confessed to past drug use, it was on camera. When she had a major psychological breakthrough about her fear of judgment, it was packaged for the audience. If every major epiphany is timed for Sweeps Week or formulated for a magazine spread, what happens to the definition of authentic? Like, she didn't just report her life on TV, she lived it through the TV format. How does this redefine what it means to be authentic?
It forces us to redefine authenticity entirely. In the therapeutic culture, authenticity is no longer defined as possessing an unchanging private core self. Authenticity becomes the willingness to perform your inner psychological work in public.
The performance is the realness.
Precisely. The transparency of the process becomes the proof of authenticity. When she interviews a guest about their abuse and she begins to cry and share her own abuse, the confession itself is the reality. The boundary between the public broadcast and the private self completely dissolves. There is no backstage anymore.
And that complete dissolution of boundaries wasn't just a quirk of her personal biography. It became the architectural blueprint for the format of the show itself. To really understand how radical this was, you have to look at what talk television looked like before this specific therapeutic model took over. You have to look at Phil Donahue.
Oh, Donahue.
Yeah.
He was the pioneer of the daytime talk format, but his sociological function was entirely different.
How so?
Donahue was issue-oriented. He treated the television studio like a town hall. He would bring on experts to discuss macro-level issues, the national economy, foreign policy, medical ethics. He maintained a conversational tone, but there was always a distanced journalistic familiarity. He was a moderator managing a debate.
Right. Donahue would do an hour on the geopolitical implications of the Cold War. And then this new therapeutic format comes along and does an hour on why middle-class women feel too guilty to use their good china for everyday dinners.
Exactly.
Or like an entire episode dedicated to women who are physically terrified to walk out to their mailboxes without wearing full makeup. It was a massive pivot from the macro to the microscopic textures of daily life.
It shifted the focus from the political citizen to the psychological self.
Yeah.
And to facilitate that shift, the physical and dramaturgic structure of the show had to change. The analysis compares the new format to classical Greek tragedy.
Really? Greek tragedy?
Yes, because the physical stage was split. Down on the stage, you had the guests, the protagonists, who were publicly wrestling with their emotional conflicts and moral failures. But then you had the studio audience.
And the audience wasn't just there to clap, they functioned as the Greek chorus.
Precisely. In a Greek tragedy, the chorus represents the moral voice of the community. They comment on the actions of the protagonist, expressing outrage, pity, or judgment. The daytime studio audience was handed the microphone and encouraged to actively dissect the moral choices of the guests.
And the host wasn't a detached moderator like Donahue. The host operated as a charismatic leader of a secular ministry. The currency of the show was an ethic of care. It wasn't about winning a debate. It was about tears, hugs, and emotional breakthroughs.
This brings up a critical distinction regarding the economics of the genre. Donahue operated on a traditional transactional model. If he wanted a high-profile guest, for instance, the police officers involved in the Rodney King case, he was willing to pay them.
Wow. Okay.
The logic was simple. The network makes money off the broadcast, so the people providing the content should be compensated. But the therapeutic model operated on an absolute refusal to pay guests for their stories.
Wait, I have to challenge this. The claim is that the exchange was purely moral and spiritual, but that feels like an incredibly convenient smokescreen. We are talking about a media empire that generated billions of dollars in advertising revenue. They took the raw, agonizing material of ordinary people's traumas, broadcast it globally, and reaped massive financial rewards. Even if she didn't write them a check, isn't there a profound commodification happening here? She's taking the raw material of ordinary people's pain and turning it into surplus value for a media empire. How does she reconcile that?
That is the central tension of the entire enterprise. To explain how this massive wealth transfer happens without triggering public outrage, we have to look at a concept called person fetishism. You are likely familiar with the Marxist concept of commodity fetishism, where the shiny product on the shelf is completely divorced from the exploited labor that produced it.
Right, you buy the smartphone, but you don't think about the factory worker.
Exactly. Person fetishism is the inversion of that. In this television format, the person and their private suffering become the commodity. But the economic transaction is deliberately obscured by the therapeutic framing.
Because it's framed as healing.
Yes. Because the host frames the interview as a ministry of healing, as an act of public care. The audience doesn't perceive it as a cynical business transaction. The guest receives the symbolic value of being heard, of experiencing public catharsis. The audience receives the emotional release, and the network quietly collects the ad revenue. The vocabulary of therapy completely masks the mechanics of capitalism.
It's performative reality. The confession on the stage isn't just recounting a past event. The act of confessing is the event.
Right.
The tearful reconciliation between an estranged mother and daughter isn't just television capturing reality. The television show is generating that reality in real time.
And once that highly interactive dramaturgic machine was built, we have to examine what kind of material they fed into it. Because they didn't just stick to polite, relatable issues like the good china and the makeup. They used this therapeutic machinery to pry open the darkest, most deeply hidden secrets of the middle-class family.
This is where the analysis gets genuinely unsettling. The show had this bizarre duality. On Monday, they might magnify the mundane, like the guilt over the china. But on Tuesday, they would place that mundane, relatable, middle-class aesthetic right alongside extreme, shocking deviance.
To understand the psychological impact of this programming, we look to Sigmund Freud's concept of das Unheimliche, which translates to the uncanny.
The uncanny.
Now, the uncanny isn't just a monster in the woods. Freud defined it as the terrifying moment when the deeply familiar, the safe, the domestic, the Heimlich, suddenly reveals itself to be strange, foreign, and dangerous.
Ooh, that gives me chills.
It is the horror of discovering that the secrets you thought were locked outside the house have actually been hiding in your living room the entire time.
The source material provides two deeply disturbing examples of how the show weaponized the uncanny. Let's look at the first one. The show does a segment featuring ordinary suburban PTA moms. These are women who bake the cookies, organize the school fundraisers, and represent the absolute bedrock of middle-class safety and respectability. And then sitting right there on the comfortable armchairs of the set, the show reveals that these specific moms secretly work as sex workers at night.
It takes the ultimate symbol of maternal safety and completely subverts it. It forces the viewer to look at their own neighbor, their own PTA meetings, with a sudden creeping suspicion.
But the second example is even darker, and it requires a deep dive into the actual transcript of the show. It's an episode featuring an incestuous relationship. The guests are a stepfather named Tom and his stepdaughter, Sean.
A very heavy episode.
The audience learns that Tom began molesting Sean when she was just 8 years old. It is an abhorrent, horrifying crime. But what makes the transcript so uncanny, what makes your skin actually crawl when you read it, is the way Tom speaks.
He doesn't sound like a cartoon villain. He doesn't sound like a monster lurking in an alleyway.
No. He uses the exact same therapeutic, middle-class vocabulary that the show itself champions. He sits on national television and justifies years of child abuse by talking about his marital friction.
Unbelievable.
He says he was feeling a lack of acceptance from his wife. He even tries to frame the abuse of an 8-year-old child as a twisted form of progressive parenting, claiming he treated her as an equal and communicated with her.
He's deploying the language of couples counseling to justify incest. If we connect this to the bigger picture, this is exactly how the show queers the middle-class ethos. Now, I am using queering here in the strict academic sense of destabilizing foundational assumptions and breaking down rigid categories.
Right.
By placing extreme deviance inside the mundane setting of a talk show and allowing the perpetrator to use polite therapeutic language, the show forces the viewer into a state of moral vertigo. The show doesn't provide easy villains. It provides a cacophony of justifications that stretch the viewer's moral imagination.
But I have a massive problem with this. I understand the sociological function of destabilizing norms, but look at the cost. By giving perpetrators a platform to explain their internal psychology, does the show risk creating a democracy of pain, where every action, no matter how heinous, is just viewed as a symptom of a troubled childhood?
A democracy of pain. That's a powerful phrase.
Yeah, like if we validate the psychology of the abuser on the same stage where we comfort the victim, do we lose the ability to assign actual objective blame? If everything is just a trauma response, is anyone actually guilty?
That is the most profound ethical tension generated by the genre. If everyone on the stage is framed as a victim of their own psyche, the hard line between perpetrator and victim blurs significantly. The show essentially flattened the moral landscape. This directly bridges into how the show explicitly handles victims and the specific narratives of trauma, constructing what the analysis calls a carnival of sufferers.
It really was an inverted mirror of the professional world. Think about the private case files sitting in the locked cabinets of psychologists, social workers, and divorce attorneys. The show took those locked files, ripped them open, and turned them into public spectacle.
Yeah, they really did.
The text categorizes these sufferers into 4 distinct groups. You have the failed self, people who just can't seem to achieve happiness or stability, the assaulted self, the survivors of abuse or violent crime, broken relations, people navigating the wreckage of divorce and betrayal, and finally, misfortunes by blind fate, people struck by terminal illness or random accidents.
And to make this public spectacle function as compelling television, the producers relied on specific narrative structures to evoke precise moral emotions from the audience. They weren't just showing pain, they were orchestrating the reaction to it.
How so?
Well, the first major emotional lever was indignation.
Right. Indignation is evoked when the audience is presented with a clear violation of societal norms, especially when society at large is ignoring it. For example, the show did intense segments highlighting famous athletes who were abusing their wives while their sports leagues and fans looked the other way. The narrative demands that the audience feel outrage at the systemic hypocrisy.
Exactly. And the second emotional structure is compassion, which borders on classical tragedy. This is evoked by the sudden, terrifying eruption of moral chaos into an otherwise good and decent life. The prime example used in the analysis is the actor Paul Michael Glaser.
Right. He had what appeared to be a perfect fairy tale Hollywood marriage. And then his wife received a blood transfusion tainted with HIV and unknowingly passed the virus to their children. It is an unfathomable nightmare.
The sociological text compares this to the biblical story of Job. It is the absolute horror of blind, indifferent fate destroying the innocent. When presented with this narrative, the audience cannot feel indignation because there is no human villain to blame.
It's just tragic.
The only available response is deep, overwhelming compassion and a terrifying realization of their own vulnerability.
But the ultimate narrative structure, the one that arguably defines modern identity more than any other, is the trauma narrative. The trauma narrative doesn't just recount a sad event from the past, it demands a psychic reenactment in the present.
Yes, exactly.
The guest is expected to mentally transport themselves back to the exact moment their sense of self fractured, and they must perform that fracturing for the cameras.
The apotheosis of this format was the appearance of a guest named Trudy Chase. The analysis refers to her as a super victim. Chase had endured childhood abuse so chronic and horrific that her psyche fractured into 92 distinct personalities as a survival mechanism.
The television segments with Trudy Chase were almost unbearably intense. It was a live broadcast of a shattered mind. And the trauma narrative was so potent, so overwhelming, that it actually broke the charismatic leader.
It was a very famous moment.
During the interview, the host completely lost her composure. She physically broke down, crying uncontrollably on the stage, eventually admitting that Chase's story had triggered her own stuff.
That moment is the ultimate validation of the therapeutic format. The host ceases to be an interviewer and becomes a fellow patient. We see a similar trajectory with frequent guests who later became experts themselves, like Iyanla Vanzant.
Oh, yes.
She mirrored Oprah's trajectory, really. She entered the public sphere by detailing her own horrific experiences with domestic violence and abuse, and eventually transitioned into a best-selling author and spiritual guide.
So what does this all mean for the listener? We are watching a masterclass in how to format our own pain. She taught an entire generation that to be healed, you must first construct a coherent, televised narrative of your trauma. Your wounds become your resume.
To understand how profound a societal shift this represents, the analysis introduces the political philosopher Hannah Arendt. Arendt wrote extensively about the politics of pity, a concept she originally used to describe how societies react to massive political upheavals, revolutions, or distant famines.
Like reacting to large-scale tragedy.
Right. We observe the suffering masses from afar, and our pity drives political action. But the daytime talk show transported this framework into the domestic sphere, turning intimate personal pain into a public spectacle that demands recognition.
It politicized private pain. And to prove how deeply this framework permeates her worldview, we have to look at how she applied this exact same therapeutic narrative to the realm of high culture and literature. We have to look at the book club.
The book club. Launched in 1995, it was a massive cultural event. On the surface, it seemed like a pivot toward gentility, bringing an aura of respectability to the show.
It felt like stepping away from the sensationalism, the incest transcripts, and the PTA prostitutes and trying to elevate the discourse.
It certainly provided that illusion. However, the sociological analysis argues that the book club is actually a radical continuation of the show's exact focus on suffering. The books selected were not random works of varied literary fiction. They adhered to a remarkably strict sociological formula.
The text identifies 6 recurring themes that practically guarantee a novel fits the brand. Think about massive bestsellers from the club, like The Deep End of the Ocean, White Oleander, or Midwives. When you break them down, the formula is glaring.
Let's hear them.
First, the protagonist is almost always a female of middle or lower class standing who is suddenly thrust into intense hardship, poverty, disease, or the loss of a child.
Right. And second, these novels completely subvert the traditional romance narrative.
Right.
These women are not waiting for a Prince Charming to rescue them. They are usually already deeply embedded in dense, suffocating family webs.
Third, the central plot mechanism is almost always the violent implosion of the family unit itself. The threat doesn't come from the outside world. The threat is inside the house.
Fourth, you see a constant exploration of troubled, uncertain, or failing motherhood. The narratives focus heavily on mothers making catastrophic mistakes.
Fifth, when salvation finally arrives, it almost never comes from a romantic male partner. Survival is achieved through a dense web of female friendships. Women save each other.
Which leads to the sixth element, the treatment of male characters. In these selections, men are generally bifurcated into 2 categories. They're either actively abusive and destructive forces, or, if they are kind, they're depicted as entirely passive. The Jew men are completely marginal to the plot.
She takes this medium, the novel, which traditionally ends in a wedding, and turns it into a mirror of her talk show, where the happy ending is just a woman surviving her own family.
This raises an important question. Why did millions of readers eagerly devour these relentlessly tragic books? Why seek out stories of such profound misery? The text argues that within the therapeutic framework, suffering is no longer viewed the way it was in the biblical story of Job.
Where you just endure it.
Exactly. For Job, suffering is just a test of faith. But the suffering in Oprah's book selections is psychologically transformative. It is the very vector through which these women claim their identity.
They suffer, therefore they become. And that perfectly synthesizes how Eva Ilau's text proves Oprah is not just an entertainer. She was a moral architect who provided a compass for the new and normal chaos of late modernity. She gave us the vocabulary of the therapeutic self.
It is a remarkable legacy of cultural engineering.
And for you, listening to this deep dive right now, this isn't just abstract sociology. Every single time you sit down with a friend and describe a work environment as toxic, or tell a partner that you need closure, or defend an emotional boundary by fiercely stating my truth, you are speaking a dialect popularized and distributed by this specific cultural empire.
You are utilizing the tools she provided to navigate your own chaos.
And that leads me to a final thought for you to carry into your day. We've talked about how Oprah turned the private living room into a public television studio. But think about your own internal monologue. When you fail, or when you hurt, or when you're trying to untangle a conflict, do you secretly interview yourself? Have we all internalized an imaginary talk show host demanding that we confess our traumas just so we can finally feel real? Something to think about the next time you try to pinpoint exactly when things went wrong.
It has been a truly fascinating deep dive. Thank you for taking this journey into the architecture of modern emotion with us.
Thanks for joining us, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.